네, 여러분 안녕하십니까. 지금부터 제11차 평화학포럼을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 저는 오늘 사회를 맡은 서울대학교 행정대학원 구민수고요. 저희 평화학포럼 기획운영위원장을 맡고 있습니다. 자, 올해 마지막 행사가 되겠습니다. 한 해 시작하고 지가 얼마 안 되는 것 같은데 벌써 12월 중순 이후에 이제 딱 보름 남았습니다. 작년에 이어서 이제 올해 2년차 평화포럼 행사를 진행해 왔는데요. 올해도 저희 좋은 분들 보시고 귀한 말씀 들을 수 있는 굉장히 알찬 시간이지 않았는가 저희 작성을 해보고 오늘은 또 굉장히 귀한 분을 모셨습니다. 그 WFP 월푸드 프로그램의 한국 사무소 소장을 맡고 계시는 윤선희 소장님, 다리안 윤 소장님을 모시고 북한의 식량 지원, 특히 아동과 여성에 대한 식량 지원 문제에 대해서 말씀을 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다. 여기 연사 소개가 나와 있는데요. 제가 간략히 또 좀 말씀드리면 윤 소장님께서는 대단히 특이한 경력을 갖고 계시는데 한국 분이시지만 이란에서 실생을 하셨습니다. 맞죠?
사실 한국에서, 근데 이란에서, 예.
출생을 하시고 바로
네.
이란으로 가신 거고요.
네네.
그다음에 아프리카 말라위에서도
컸습니다. 예.
그다음에 공부는 남아공 요하네스버그에서 대학을 마치셨어요. 그리고 2002년도에 초급 전문가 JPO 프로그램 시험에 합격을 하셨고요. 2003년부터
맞습니다.
2003년부터 WFP에서 근무를 하셨습니다. 그러니까 올해가 이제 횟수로는 20년 다 되고 만으로도 이제 20년 돼요. 그동안 이제 WFP 여러 사무소에서 맹활약을 해 오시다가 한국에는 지난 7월에 여름에 부임을 하셨습니다. 가장 최근에 이제 언론 보도에서 아마 많은 분들이 보시지는 못하겠지만 언론 보도에서 북한 관련해서 또 인터뷰를 하시기도 했어요. 북한이 코로나 때문에 엄격하게 국경 통제를 하고 있는데 그것 때문에 굉장히 취약계층들이 어려움을 많이 겪고 있다고 하고 윤 소장님 말씀으로는 북한에 지금 국제기구가 지원한 식량이 바닥나 있는 상황을 하는데 국경 통제가 심하다 보니까 들어가지 못하고 있어서 북한 정부가 국경 통제를 완화해야 한다는 말씀을 해주시고 있습니다. 오늘 강연은 저희가 영어로 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. 윤 소장님께서 한국말을 굉장히 잘 하시는데 그래도 북한 관련돼서 혹시 또 말씀하시는데 정확한 의미가 전달이 안 되는 거를 매우 걱정을 하셔서 그냥 편하게 영어로 진행을 하시고 그리고 Q&A 때는 상황을 봐서 영어 또는 한국어로 병행해서 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. 자, 그러면 마이크를 윤 소장님께 넘기도록 하겠습니다. 소장님 부탁드립니다.
감사합니다. 감사합니다, 교수님. Thank you very much for that introduction and good afternoon to everybody online. I am Marian Yun, or Yun Son-hee, of the United Nations World Food Programme, and it is a great honor to have been invited to the 11th IPUS Peace Research Forum as a speaker. I would first like to express my gratitude to the Center, to Professor, and to all of the professors, fellows, and researchers of the Institute for hosting this event. The topic of peace is very close to the heart of our organization. It's because we are working under the motto of food is the pathway to peace. In Korean, that would be 식량은 평화로 가는 길. Therefore, I would like to use this opportunity to introduce you to WFP, the World Food Programme, and our work pertaining to peace and stability before we go into the situation in North Korea or DPRK. First and foremost, allow me to introduce what we as an organization does so that we can give you a picture of how food plays a role in peace. You may wonder, what does WFP have when it comes to peace building? And that is where I would like to then focus a little bit on our role and what we see as our contribution towards peace building and stability. Last but not least, I'd like to look at WFP's response in the DPRK, commonly known as North Korea. I will introduce you to the food and nutrition assistance to women and men in this country, and to give you a glimpse picture of the situation as we see it. I hope that through this lecture and this opportunity, all of you will have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about what we do, and especially in DPRK. It was a very humbling moment at the end of last year when the World Food Programme was awarded the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize. Some of you may have already heard about that. And in fact, just a few days ago, our executive director was in Oslo, marking the first anniversary, and the first time that he was able to be there in person due to the pandemic, causing some challenges to travel. It was a very humbling recognition of the work that we do, and the role that food plays when it comes to conflict and insecurity. And this presentation will give me an opportunity to perhaps go a little bit more in depth into that subject. But let me start by just quoting our executive director, Mr. David Beasley, who has been saying that, quote, "Until the day we have a medical vaccine, food is the best vaccine against chaos." The award of the Nobel Peace Prize is indeed a reflection of and a recognition of the strong advocacy for ending hunger in order to achieve peace, and also the acknowledgement on the role of food as a tool for peace. The Nobel Committee announced that WFP was awarded for its efforts to combat hunger, for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace in conflict-affected areas, and for acting as a driving force to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war. In particular, WFP continues to show excellence in the midst of the unprecedented global crisis that we are all going through, the COVID-19 pandemic, and against such difficult situations, conditions in the field. Simply put, food is an indispensable issue when we are paving our way towards peace. Security concerns when it comes to war and conflict are a catalyst that exacerbate food problems. WFP provides food assistance to those in dire need at the forefront to fight hunger worldwide. Why is the food pathway to peace? And what is the situation that we're living in today? Well, as this slide is entitled "A Pandemic on Top of a Pandemic," we have a pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, but before the world was hit by this pandemic, it already had another pandemic, and that for WFP was the food insecurity or hunger pandemic. In a world where we produce enough food to feed everyone, up to 811 million people still go to bed hungry at night. That's this number here. As of November 2020, so last month, up to 283 million people, this number here, are actually food insecure or at high risk in 80 countries. This is a record high and a devastating increase of 12.4 million people just since June. So in a matter of a few months, this number of 283 has increased by 12 million more. There are 45 million people living in about 43 different countries who are at the doorstep of famine, meaning a little longer, another little crisis, and these men, women, and children will be facing starvation. There is a way of measuring the acuteness of hunger, and from 1 out of 5, these 45 million people are at 4, and 5 means famine. So you can imagine how urgent the situation is for these 45 million people. Our operations, when we look to 2022, are only getting bigger, are only getting worse. If we look at Afghanistan, we expect that Afghanistan alone is going to need about $220 million every month. And that is just to feed the population that need assistance, which is already about half of the population. On top of that all, we've got climate change related disasters that are doubling since the early 1990s, with an average of 213 events every year. Climate shock is yet another key driver of hunger. And I don't need to go into that too much today, but I think we all know the urgency and importance of addressing climate change across the globe. It is a crisis that will affect every single person, not just those who are hungry and vulnerable. But war and conflict, which is really what I'd like to focus on today, is the leading cause of hunger in the world. And war and conflict can cause food insecurity and hunger, as much as hunger and food insecurity exacerbates existing tensions and can trigger violence on the ground. So let me move through these next few slides relatively quickly, because I think I've spoken a little bit about the role of WFP, but really just to give an overview of what WFP is all about. We were formed in 1961 as an experiment, actually. In 2021, we are now the largest humanitarian organization in the world. And our work is all about zero hunger, achieving zero hunger, ending hunger, which is the second goal of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We work right now in 88 countries, one of them being DPRK, and we have 20,600 staff around the world, most of whom are based in the front lines. They are working in the field. And we operate based on 100% voluntary contributions, which means that every year, in order to assist the people in 88 countries, we need to raise the funds from public and private donors. And South Korea, the Republic of Korea, is also one of our most important donors in that regard. In addition to providing food assistance, WFP is also the lead agency when it comes to logistics and emergency telecommunications. We provide services such as the movement of humanitarian cargo and passenger, as you can see in the picture there, not just for our staff and our operation, but for the entire humanitarian community. And this also extends to the telecommunications sector, where especially if there has been a natural disaster like an earthquake in Haiti, where all the telecommunication infrastructure has been affected and no longer functioning, WFP has the mandate to come in and set up emergency telecommunications infrastructure to regain connectivity and ensure that humanitarian assistance can continue. So up to now, I've spoken quite a bit about WFP's role when it comes to emergencies, saving lives. We are actually one of the first, if not the first organization to arrive at a site within 72 hours of a disaster. And we play a big role when it comes to conflict, pandemics, and other supporting other humanitarian actors that are delivering, distributing medicine, shelter, and other important items in addition to food. But what people don't really know about WFP is that we also have a second mandate, and that's what's written here as changing lives. We don't just wait for an emergency and then provide emergency assistance. As and when emergency assistance is happening, we always try to work with the people to try and improve their nutrition and build resilience so that before the next shock or when the next shock hits, they are better prepared, they are stronger, they are able to withstand those shocks and knocks, and nutritionally their bodies are able to cope, and that during times of need, they will be able to, their bodies will be able to cope better, even if they have access to less nutrition and food. How do we do this? And this is really about the Changing Lives mandate. So in addition to responding to emergencies, we provide food assistance, but we don't just provide food assistance in the form of food, we provide it also in the form of cash. And the reason being that when you provide cash to beneficiaries, they have a little bit more choice. Most of the countries that we work are countries that are that are still very much developing, with weak capacities, with weak infrastructure, but they do have local markets. And so the way we provide food assistance by giving cash instead of giving food that we've imported from somewhere else can also play a big role when it comes to stimulating local economies and providing opportunities for businesses and communities as well. As I mentioned, we do provide a service called Humanitarian Air Service. It's an airline. It's an airline that, when the COVID first hit and all the countries closed their borders and none of the airlines were flying, WFP came in and triggered this operation, United Nations Humanitarian Air Service, so that the staff who continued to work during the pandemic were able to move around and get to the places to reach the people who needed our assistance. So our staff needed still to access those countries and locations, and this is when the service gets triggered, and we operate basically a humanitarian airline. Disaster risk reduction is what I mentioned earlier about building people's resilience so that when the next crisis hits, they are stronger, the land is able to withstand shocks, and the community have themselves a stronger resilience to cope to future shocks. Nutrition, school feeding, food assistance for assets. These are some of the different program areas that WFP looks at. And then smallholder farmers being very important when it comes to food. When you talk about global food security, you can't not talk about smallholder farmers who actually produce more than 60% of the food that we produce. We cannot address hunger without working with smallholder farmers wherever we are. Capacity building and digital innovations are also cross-cutting themes that are mainstreamed across everything that we do. So everything that we do, whether it is in nutrition, school feeding, emergency response, or working with farmers, has a strong capacity building component in it. So while we do, we also teach. And then there's digital innovation, an area where I think South Korea has quite a lot of potential to play and are already playing. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. This slide just shows you a number of different innovative projects that we do, starting with hydroponics and growing food in deserts and in areas that are struggling with desertification. We do quite a lot of work on fortifying the types of food that we distribute, and then also using things like blockchain and iris scans to make our programs much more effective. Now, when it comes to peace building, as I said earlier on, one might think, well, what does the World Food Programme and food assistance have to do with peace? Food insecurity and malnutrition, as I said, are largely caused by three key drivers: conflict, climate change, and economic disparities. So the 3 C's: conflict, climate change, and COVID, all of which result in instabilities in society. Instability and conflict disrupt the normal way of life, the normal way of functioning. They disrupt supply chains, they increase food prices, they destroy food reserves and politicize the distribution and hinder access to food. So, for instance, in conflict-affected areas where agriculture and trade are disrupted, a simple plate of food can cost more than a day's wages. WFP research has found that in South Sudan, for example, people on average would have to spend almost double, 186% to be exact, of their daily salary on ingredients for a basic meal, such as rice and beans. So the cost of food and the cost of getting the food to that place becomes so expensive that when you compare it to what someone in New York would have to pay for their meal, in terms of the proportion of their salary, their daily wage, one meal in South Sudan is equivalent to costing $393. $393 for one meal. So in addition to that, fragility and conflict roll back whatever development gains we might have made, and they weaken government systems, including health systems, all in all, leaving societies much more vulnerable. Conflict, hunger, migration, and displacement are also intertwined. The issue of refugees and migrant crisis in Europe, these are people who are leaving their homes because in search of basic services and because they don't have enough to eat, that they don't have jobs to keep them where they were. And so food insecurity combined with conflict is a critical push factor, driving people to move, along with limited economic opportunities and income inequality. Violent conflict is not only preventing individuals and communities and societies from achieving their full potential, but the cost of violence, as we know, is also tremendous. It is in the tens of trillions every year. I don't think that I am in any position to define or define what peace is to those of you who have joined this discussion online. But for WFP, we go by the fact that there is no universally recognized definition of peace. But in our policy, in our policy that talks about WFP's role in peace building, we recognize 3 different types of peace: the negative peace, which is basically the absence of war or conflict; the positive peace, the ability to prevent, manage, and resolve conflict without violence by using political and social change processes, such as mediation and negotiation, to achieve inclusive political settlements and eventually an improved quality of life. And then there's the sustainable peace, which would be socio-political conditions in which the needs of all are taken into account, and in a way that prevents outbreak and escalation or recurrence of conflict, because there has been something to address the root or structural cause of the conflict, and therefore a reconciliation is possible. I'd like to say that, in the 88 countries that WFP works in, and when you look at the whole world, 65%, in fact, more than 65% of all the interventions that WFP implements happens in conflict-affected countries. So WFP has actually a very important role to play when it comes to supporting social transitions towards peace. And admittedly, we are still learning about how our programs can do this better, to make our programs more effective in being able to address the root causes behind hunger, of which I have already mentioned that conflict is actually the leading factor today. Once again, our policy goes quite in depth into making sure that our role when it comes to peace building is clear when it comes to the principles. I don't think that we are a peace building organization, but through our programs, we can certainly support peace building efforts and stability in general. And so without going too much into detail, I think some of these principles, of which 8 are listed here, are quite logical. We need to make sure that we understand the context where we're working. We need to make sure that we're not creating a new mandate for ourselves, but that everything we do still maintains a focus on hunger. And whatever we do, we should make sure that we are respecting the safety and dignity of those people that we're serving, and to avoid exacerbating conflict and tension on the ground. So making sure that we are doing no harm. We always work through national authorities on the ground. And so we should support these national priorities where possible, but also making sure that we are adhering to humanitarian principles and international law at all times and without compromise. WFP is part of a bigger UN system, and we don't work alone, and therefore it's important that we are contributing towards a UN-wide coherent approach, and making sure that that all our programs are responsive and agile to changing contexts. We are inclusive, we're equitable, and that we are realistic. We are not there to try and reconcile warring parties. Our job there is to address hunger. So again, I'm not going to go into too much depth here. This really summarizes some of the principles that we do, and for WFP as well as many other development partners and stakeholders. We talk a lot about the Humanitarian Development and Peace Nexus, or the HDP Nexus, and WFP. You know, for WFP, this nexus work is very important because basically it means when there is an emergency, you can't do it in isolation of putting in place solutions that will address the more longer term or root causes. And so basically, in short, the principles that we work towards when it comes to supporting this nexus is making sure that we're providing the right assistance to the right people at the right time in the right way, and all of these principles are evident in the policy that guides us when working in a conflict situation and where we have a role to play in contributing to peace and stability on the ground. I rushed through that quite quickly because I really want to focus the rest of the time that we have on our work in DPRK. And I know that this is where there is a great deal of interest here in Korea, and indeed for WFP, our operation in DPRK is very important, and one of the more complex contexts where we work. WFP has been present in DPRK since 1995. Providing humanitarian assistance to vulnerable women and children. And we've made significant progress in reducing levels of child malnutrition in DPRK. But as we all know, DPRK still faces insufficient food production. And this is exacerbated by a lack of diverse diet, which results in chronic food insecurity and malnutrition. And so there's still very high levels of undernourishment. There is still high rates of stunting. Stunting is a measurement of malnutrition, basically going by how tall you are for your age. and then things like anemia. Poor nutrition is particularly problematic for young children, pregnant women, and breastfeeding mothers, as well as kids, babies who are in their early years. Rates of stunting among children under 5 are moderate to high, with still 1 in 4 children affected. So we've got a country strategic plan in DPRK that has 3 broad pillars. The first is really tackling that nutrition issue that I was just talking about. The second is reducing vulnerability to natural disasters by working with communities through asset creation activities that can reduce vulnerability to future shocks. And then the third is, when needed, to respond with humanitarian assistance when there is a drought or some kind of a situation on the ground that requires us to come in with emergency distribution, so general food distribution. This is just a snapshot of our operating areas in DPRK. WFP has actually the widest coverage, programmatic coverage in DPRK among all stakeholders. From what I understand, we have access, physical access to 60 out of 210 operational areas in 9 out of the 11 provinces. The nutrition pillar, the first of the 3 pillars that you saw in the previous slide, is our main program, and that program works with those orange and those red and yellow dots all signify factories that produce fortified biscuits or fortified cereal mixes that are then distributed through different institutions and given to people like children under young kids, babies, and pregnant as well as lactating mothers. So this basically just summarizes how WFP does this in a very simplified way. We first procure and transport the raw materials. That's wheat, sugar, dried skim milk, oil, etc. We buy that and we transport it to North Korea, which is then taken to these local food factories, made, which that then produce either the biscuits or the cereal mixes. And in this process, the food is then fortified with the needed nutrients and supplements, vitamins and minerals to make them nutritious for the beneficiaries. So this is just a slide that shows a little bit of how this nutrition assistance is provided and to whom. So as I mentioned, they are women, children in nurseries, children in kindergartens, as well as boarding schools, and then patients in hospitals and pediatric wards. The nutritious fortified cereals and biscuits help prevent further malnutrition. They provide macro and micronutrients to these population groups, and the food, the fortified cereals that are distributed to pregnant and lactating women and girls complement their regular diets, so they get additional nutrients through these commodities in addition to their daily meals. And then through these programs, we also use the opportunity to distribute hygiene and nutrition-related messages. Messages are really important because this is about building awareness and changing behavior, and making sure that beneficiaries are not just receiving the assistance, but understand the reasons behind why. So a few slides showing how we distribute, how we implement these programs. This on the right-hand side, we very frequently measure the height of children at different ages. This is to determine their stunting, the indicators around stunting. And on the left, you can see a picture of the commodity. I guess this is the cereal mix being measured and given to the beneficiary. When we talk about nutrition, we talk about the first 1,000 days. So first 1,000 days of a child that the 1,000 days starts from conception. So from the time that it is already, the baby is in the mother's womb to the time that it is 2 years old, this is a period where a child, if the child doesn't receive certain nutritions in this very short period, they will be stunted for life. There is nothing that can do to reverse that stunting after this period. And so the first 1,000 days when it comes to nutrition is absolutely critical, and a period that will impact that child's life for the rest of its life. So if you look at this picture, there are 3 kids, they're all same height. But what we don't know is that on the left, his name is Johnny. He's severely malnourished. He's 11.3 years old, this boy here. The middle girl, Glenda, is 9. She's moderately malnourished. And then this little boy here, he's a normal kid. He's 5.8 years old. So this is an example of what chronic malnutrition, also known as stunting, does to a child, a growing child. These are just additional pictures just to give you a glimpse of some of the factories and the activities going on in the factories where WFP produces its biscuits and its cereal mixes. You can see on the right-hand side, biscuits are being produced. These are stamped WFP and then packaged and then distributed to the different institutions, which you can see the operation in the other pictures as well. And this is a picture of the biscuit. You can see it's printed WFP, and these are the kids, nursery and kindergarten kids, eating the biscuits and having their little porridge. These are some of the pancakes and different types of breads that are made using some of the cereal mixes that are produced through these factories. I don't think I need to explain the other picture. We know that over the years, the situation has not been great in DPRK, but I think in recent years we can also say that things were improving. At least certainly in the last 10 years, things have improved, at least nutritionally. But with COVID and the last 2 years, to be really honest with you, no one really knows. Well, at least WFP. Not enough is really known about how the households are faring right now. Let me go into a little bit of detail about the latest information that we have on DPRK. As I mentioned, over the years, longer term trends in nutrition particularly have been positive. The UNICEF Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, also known as MIX, in 2017 did show that in the 8 period from 2009 until 2017, the proportion of children under 5 who were underweight had halved. Yeah, so that's a very good progress. It also showed that children under 5 suffering from acute malnutrition had also halved, and stunting, the chronic malnutrition we spoke about just now, also decreased in the same period from 32% of children to just 19%. So these are quite significant progresses. But what we need to focus on is the fact that there's still 312,000 kids who are stunted in DPRK. So they might have improved, but that 19%, which translates to 312,000, is still not an ideal situation. 2018 saw the worst main harvest in a decade, one which came in 12% below the long-term average, underlining how vulnerable DPRK's agriculture sector is both to climate change and to fluctuations in the supply of basic agricultural inputs like fuel, fertilizer, and electricity. And this harvest in 2018 left a big gap, equivalent to 3.5 months of consumption. Consequently, at that time, WFP estimated that over 10 million people, or 40% of the population, would need some kind of food assistance in 2019. Now, in 2019, Not surprisingly, the public distribution system ration was at its lowest. It was at the lowest that it had been in 8 years, and 10% below the 10-year average. So put in another way, in 2019, the government simply did not have enough resources to adequately feed its population. The 2019 harvest, however, defied expectations in a different way. In spite of rather difficult climatic conditions, the government did report a bumper harvest of 6.65 million metric tons at that time, the highest for a decade. So largely as a result of all of this, the PDS rations, the public distribution system rations throughout 2020 were reported to be some of the highest levels ever recorded by WFP. And what was surprising was that this ration, we understand that this ration size, the high, being quite high level, was kept high during the lean season, something that WFP had almost never seen in DPRK in the past. So what might explain this? It must be the supply of bilateral food aid. We haven't been able to ascertain how much bilateral food aid had arrived in the marketing year 2019 to 2020, but sustaining the public distribution rations at such a level would have absolutely required some significant injection of food into the country. Just to quickly give you a glimpse of what I've been talking about when it comes to the public distribution system rations, you can see in 2019 the levels were relatively low, but in 2020 comparatively, also comparatively to the 10-year average, the levels were reported to be very high. So to recap, when the global COVID pandemic began, DPRK, WFP can deduce that in DPRK, DPRK was at the time enjoying a trend of declining hunger and malnutrition before the COVID hit. Even though there were still significant numbers of citizens affected by food insecurity and malnutrition, we can generalize and conclude that DPRK, things were actually going okay. Although the country faced both peaks and troughs in its agricultural production, by the time COVID lockdown came in early 2020, the country was to some extent insulated on account of the bumper harvest I mentioned in 2019. Unfortunately, as the pandemic hit, all of that was put to a big question. Borders closed in February 2020. Travel inside the country was severely restricted, to say the least. Tight controls were imposed on imports. Strict quarantine requirements effectively turned into total import bans, which are still maintained today. You know, I don't have to go into all of these details. We know that the situation in DPRK is quite unknown, to be honest. And then furthermore, in 2020, we know that climatically, DPRK suffered some very dry conditions. There was also reports of flooding. And therefore, in conclusion, for this year, FAO had predicted that the country was facing a food gap of about 860,000 metric tons, which is equivalent to about 2 months worth of consumption. Now, WFP, the last country director, who was the last to leave among the international staff in DPRK, left DPRK in March. And since then, we don't have international staff on the ground. However, we are able to still continue some of our monitoring using remote means. And these are some of the data that we have been able to collect in recent months. And these are talking about data at the household level, so family level. Household food security has deteriorated significantly since 2020. That's clear. We can assume, I don't think that comes as a surprise, given the conditions that I've just mentioned, and the fact that the borders have been closed since February 2020. For WFP, we use something called the food consumption score, which is an indicator of the quality of the diet, both the frequency, so how often people eat, and the main food groups that are eaten, as well as the diversity of the diet. So if you look at 2019, 11% of the population had poor food consumption. But by 2021, this number had increased to 70%. In 2019, almost 30%, so 29% of the population had acceptable food consumption. But by 2021, that number was only 1%. So there is a dramatic deterioration in consumption patterns at the household level. When you look at the recipients of the public distribution system, it's even worse. This analysis shows that 84% of PDS recipients had unacceptable food consumption in 2021. It's the 3 bars on the left. But when you take a look at the farm-based population, so the 3 bars on the right, even though they're better off because of the availability of their own food, over half of them still have unacceptable food consumption in 2021. So it seems that in DPRK in 2021, there were worrying consumption patterns for both rural and urban population. I won't go into detail of this graph, but the second thing that our data revealed is that the diet itself in DPRK has narrowed. It's become less diverse. So people are eating less diverse foods. Put in another way, a high proportion of the population are eating only cereals with vegetables 5 days a week. Only 2 days a week are they getting a broader diet, and only very occasionally a source of protein. That's basically how I can conclude this graph, this graph here on the slide. The third thing our data revealed is that in the past 3 years, about 50% of households have experienced food shortages for 2 to 3 months. Food shortages are occurring partly on account of the lean season, the season that just precedes the harvest. But many now cite decreases in the PDS ration to be the principal reason for food shortages in their household. It's interesting that a decrease in PDS ration was cited as the major reason for food shortages in 2020, when the government's reported ration was at their all-time high. This is something that WFP actually does not understand entirely. So the question being asked right now to WFP and to the international community, and certainly a lot going on in the media, is this: is DPRK facing famine in 2021? Nobody really knows for sure. That's WFP's position. We don't know for sure. We can only deduce that the situation cannot be good. Because what our data shows, as I've mentioned earlier, is that there is a measured deterioration in household food insecurity, a measured deterioration since 2019. The diet is becoming narrower and less diverse, and a very tight food situation with shortages of food for periods of 2 to 3 months every year are being reported. So I don't think that that we can say any more than what our data has shown. And we were told, finally, another critical factor for 2021 and beyond will be, whether the willingness of the government to allow humanitarian food assistance to enter the country. We need to see when and how that will play out. But in spite of the constraints in 2020, WFP was able to reach 700,000 citizens with specialized nutritious food in 2020. And in 2021, we did have to stop operations because we simply ran out of food stocks. and we had no means of importing additional commodities into the country. But we remain ready to resume all of our operations the moment that the conditions on the ground allow us to do so. Many of you may not know that WFP has a very long and deep history with the Republic of Korea. In fact, between 1964 and 1984, WFP was providing, out of all the UN agencies, the largest amount of assistance here in the Republic of Korea. It was about 104 million for 23 countries, 23 projects, my apologies. Scroll forward to today, and it's remarkable. And I know I lived outside of South Korea for a long time, but I'm still a South Korean, and it's remarkable for me to sit here and report to you that South Korea is now top 10 donor country to WFP and to the United Nations. And this is something that the country has achieved in one generation. It is, as far as I know, the only country that can say that it's done this in a single generation. And for WFP, as my executive director always quotes, he always cites the Republic of Korea as a model of zero hunger. And therefore, there is so much that we need to learn from the experience of this country and the potential to work together to resolve hunger issues and in a way that contributes to peace, both here on the peninsula, but really across the board. So I really wanted to thank you for this opportunity to speak. May I leave my presentation with a small 2-minute video? It doesn't even require any explanation, and that will be the end of my presentation. Thank you.
우리는 우리의 필드를 달립니다. 필드 곳곳을 누비며 세계 각지를 누비며 그 누구보다 빠르게 필요한 곳으로 날아갑니다. 우리는 길을 만들어 달립니다. 필요한 곳에 늘 마음보다 먼저 도착합니다. 다른 이들이 쉽사리 가지 못하는 곳도 긴급 구호가 필요한 어떤 곳이든 WFP는 72시간 이내에 식량을 전달합니다. 한국은 세계에서 제로 헝거를 성취한 가장 빛나는 사례입니다. WFP로부터 20년간 받은 식량 원조를 졸업하고 이제 세계에서 10손가락에 드는 공여국이 되었습니다. 우리는 대한민국의 위상과 국격을 높입니다. 승리를 위해, 더 나은 미래를 위해, 더 나은 삶을 위해 우리는 언제나 보이지 않는 곳으로 단 하나의 희망을 가지고 달려갑니다. WFP는 식량으로 생명을 구하고 평화를 전합니다. 단 하나의 골을 위해. I deliver best goals. WFP delivers better future. Food is the pathway to peace. (2020년) 노벨 평화상 수상기간 UN 세계 식량 계획.
네, 소장님 감사합니다. So thank you very much for your great presentation. 마지막으로는 손흥민 영상으로 마무리해 주셨는데요. 저희 막둥이가 손흥민 광팬입니다. 막둥이도 보여주고 그다음에 WFP도 잘 알리도록 하겠습니다.
감사합니다.
네, 대단히 감사합니다. 윤선희 소장님 오늘 좋은 발표와 또 질의응답 다시 한번 감사드리고요.
감사합니다.
저희가 오늘 또 중요한 사실을 깨달았습니다. 깨달았다기보다는 이제 다시 한번 상기했는데요. 우리 스스로도 기아의 문제를 해결한 지가 얼마 안 됐는데 한 세대 만에 저희가 완전히 까먹어 버린 것 같아요. 지금은 이제 어떻게 하면 적게 먹고 건강하게 뭐 이런 문제, 그리고 이제 비만 문제가 오히려 우리한테는 사회적 이슈인데, 아까 이제 처음에 보여주신 것처럼 여전히 전 세계 우리가 70억 인구죠. 70억 인구 중에서 8억 가까이, 한 10% 정도 됩니다. 8억 가까이가 영양실조, malnutrition 문제에 허덕이고 있고, 3억 가까이 되는 인구가 심각한 식량 문제를 안고 있다. 이게 우리는 남의 일처럼 생각해오는 이 기아의 문제, 식량의 문제가 바로 우리 이웃인 북한에서 더 심화가 되고 있다라는 놀라운 사실을 다시 한번 상기할 수 있었습니다. 어려운 여건 속에서 많은 노력을 해 오셨는데 앞으로도 계속 노력을 많이 해주시기를 바라고요. 윤 소장님께서 앞서 설명을 잠깐 하셨지만 WFP 한국 사무소는 저희 서울대학교에 위치하고 있습니다. 저희 서울대학교 관악 캠퍼스 내에 위치하고 있는데, 저희가 이제 지금 이 서울대학교 통일평화연구원 평화포럼이 열리고 있는 곳은 시흥 캠퍼스입니다. WFP 한국 사무소에서 시흥 캠퍼스에도 좀 아웃리치할 수 있는 그런 방법 같은 것들을 같이 좀 논의를 앞으로 하시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 자, 이것으로 제11회 평화포럼을 마치겠고요. 올해 행사는 이제 오늘이 이제 마지막이 되겠습니다. 내년에 저희가 또 좋은 프로그램으로 찾아뵙도록 하겠고요. 올해 마지막 행사를 멋지게 장식해 주신 윤선희 소장님께 다시 한번 감사의 말씀드리면서 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다. 네. 내년에 뵙겠습니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다.